If that's where they want to get in.
Okay, that would be.
Yeah. It's 4 or 5 of us. I'm not sure. And I'm eating, all right. Just, sorry. You're great. How are you? I was in the meeting for this, so. We could drive over here. Oh, no. Look, I know, absolutely.
I thought you were. It's not Memorial Day. Well, no.
Oh, I see. Yeah, well, they gave me all the to hand out. What do you think of You're so hopeful. And then I'm like,
We were just discussing that. And I was like, I really hope.
But no, not really. Most of the stuff I didn't
Good
know.
luck to you. Yeah, so
Roll into that. and then-
that's perfect. Perfect.
You guys
No.
finish up.
I love the plan. We have plan B here.
Section two.
That's what we do. Chief orders me around. I do like.
Where's the other
Appreciate that.
Yeah, I don't care. That's what- you just tell me anything for something I need to know that I'll find Oh, yeah.
We're trying to keep well people well.
Dancing around the slides or?
I will do that for you. So you just let me know when you're ready for the next one. No.
Slides.
I had slides.
Okay.
Let me know when you're ready. We also have about 9 folks online, so sometimes we'll get more that pop in and pop out, and so you know, so if we do questions, we usually put in an alternate.
Okay.
So some online, some in the room. We speak in microphones.
Jersey box.
Oh,
How could be both said?
You have an avalanche. So.
Failed on the board meeting earlier this week too.
Oh, man.
Three. There was a lot of like. Yeah, no problem. I'll take it. We'll follow up. And then,
And then we'll get started as.
They were over there. Longer than I thought.
It's not like a big ball.
There's no one can read this. It's a neat piece of- They don't say that.
Yeah, whenever I check, I'm looking at it. It's on the way, here in about 10 minutes, so they want to start. And then finish up.
I just entered America.
That's true friend right there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good friends, everyone, too. Got it.
Shuffle for about 8 minutes. And then they'll be right there. Rocco said that's okay. Sound water. But he can go for it. And Seth can jump into the next one. Just make it.
To protect us. Yes, right?
Also, I'm not gonna do
Hello, good evening. We're gonna go ahead and get started. We found our missing panelists. They will be here in about 10 minutes. So we're okay. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for the 5th session in the 2023 Disaster Education and Outreach Series. My name is Emily Hogan. I'm Assistant City Manager for the City of Louisville. This series is brought to you by the City of Louisville, Town of Superior, and Boulder County. Our communities have been working together over the past years. We recovered from the Marshall Fire. Through this process, we wanted to bring together our agencies and communities to learn from experts about wildfire mitigation and other topics that might help us become more resilient. These are all of the sessions that we've had so far and have coming up. We have a couple more planned right now and then anticipate having other sessions as the year continues as well. So tonight we will be discussing lessons learned on fire behavior from the Marshall Fire. And we have local and state representatives to discuss the facilitated learning analysis that was conducted. And we'll talk about what we've learned about weather and atmospheric conditions and fire behavior. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Superior's Recovery Manager, Allison James, to go over some housekeeping items and introduce our panelists.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Allison James, Disaster Preparedness and Recovery Manager for the Town of Superior. Welcome. We're glad to see you here tonight and have so much engagement around these topics. The first couple of housekeeping items I want to share is there is a restroom to the right and then to the right. Down the hall, there's also a drinking fountain there. And we're going to hold our questions to the end and let the panelists present, just in case they answer some questions along the way. And then at the end, we'll have some time for some Q&A for everybody, including those of you joining us via online. I would like to introduce the panel this evening. And the first is with Mountain View Fire and Rescue, Chief Sterling Folder. And then we have our Louisville Fire Protection District Chief, John Wilson, and Rocco Snart with the Colorado Division of Fire Prevention and Control. And we have another panelist that'll be joining us in a few minutes, Seth McKinney with Boulder County Sheriff's Office. And I'm going to turn this over next to our panelists.
Good evening, Rocco Snart. Can you hear me okay, everybody? Make sure the online folks are there. So basically, we'll talk a little bit, I'm gonna cover some of Seth's stuff here, because I had it written into my slides. A little bit about the purpose of the FLA, or the Facilitated Learning Analysis. And what does that really mean, and why do we do those? And really, the big piece about that is that so we have a better understanding of something that happened that had a lot of unintended consequences. We adopted it in the fire service from the military because they've started to do some facilitated learning analysis with their folks, and it's taken off in a bunch of other business cultures and other places like that. But after the Marshall Fire, the Division of Fire Prevention and Control requested this FLA be stood up. So we brought in a bunch of panel specialists to conduct all the interviews and to do all the really detailed analysis on some of the situations, you know, revolving the climate and the weather and the fire behavior that went along with the Marshall Fire, so that we could learn a little bit more about that, because there really was one of those unprecedented days that most of us have never seen anything remotely like it. It was a 99th percentile day, meaning it was 99% of the days are better than that day. So that day was clearly, one of the worst days ever. So, and the purpose of the FLA is kind of to tell a story, because folks can understand and digest stories a lot better. So I'm going to try to tell a story tonight too, and hopefully nobody goes to sleep. Anyway, a little bit about some of the fire behavior and some of the things that go along with that. But typically the FLA is not a product that's digested by the civilian community. It's usually for us in the fire service, so that we have a better understanding, so we can learn how to, see these incidents that happen and develop better slides and better training and better resources to, look at a potential day like that again in the future. So if you guys have anything to add, feel free to jump right in.
You're doing fine.
So it's important to note that when we do these FLAs, that the whole purpose is to learn things from it and not to develop any kind of punitive actions from that. There are times when things are discovered in the process of that, but as long as they remain separate from the FLA and it's not part of the FLA, that's a process that happens, whether it's civilly or any other process that goes on legally. But for us in the fire service, we want to learn what happened, the conditions and all the situations that went along with that, so that we can be better in the future. So this good FLA is not going to have any causal factors or finding of cause. Not trying to find fault with anybody. I wasn't there that day. I've been on some really bad days. Whatever they did is what I would have done, I'm sure. So no cause and no, so we're just trying to get to the bottom of it. So we'll move on to the next slide. So really, when we look at the Marshall Fire, it was a day of extremes. There have been a couple of days in December that probably had equally potent atmospheric conditions that could have driven another fire very similar to that anywhere along the Front Range. If you remember back then, in December, we had just come off some of the hottest and driest parts, of the end of that year. And we've gone through, some significant wind events. Nothing really that really equated to the wind event that occurred that day. So, and then a phenomenon set up of this mountain wave. We're not strangers to mountain waves here in Colorado. We see them on a fairly regular basis. They just oftentimes don't line up when we have all of the fuels available and everything just primed and ready to go, much like on that particular day. So, thinking about December again, that day, it's the hottest and driest in about 20 years for that time of year. Here in Colorado, I look at the landscape as it's always ready to burn if it's not green, or if it doesn't have snow on it, or if it doesn't have rain. So we take all that into consideration along here, in this area. And all of those fuels that are sitting out there are certainly in prime condition of all the dry cured grasses and the shrubs and that are ready to go. Now we look at our landscapes and our homes, and we probably hadn't watered them very much since the summertime and the fall. And for general tree health, it's always good to water them during, the winter time to keep them healthier. But that sometimes doesn't always happen. And with it being as dry as it had been in those days, a lot of the trees that were out there in the urban community, out on the plains, they hadn't seen a lot of water. So they certainly were in a drought stress condition too. I mentioned drought is in there, so that was in a fairly extreme drought at that point in time. And there's many different kinds of drought, and we don't have enough hours in the night to talk about all those. And I don't want to talk about those anyway, so. But we have all those extremely dry fuels. And then we throw this mountain wave into the mix. So basically we get a weather system that sets up that allows wind to come crashing down on the lee side of the mountains and throw itself across the Front Range. Sometimes we see them as Chinook winds and we hear them said, like that, or snow eaters. Well, there's no snow to be found there, right? No precipitation. So we get this wonderful downsloping windstorm that comes across the landscape. And then unfortunately we have an ignition, which we hadn't had in some of those other events that we had seen earlier in the year. But we get an ignition in a really hard place. We're not talking about what ignition, where ignition, but we had an ignition in some fuels that had access to other fuels in the shape of grasses too, because most of the fuels that were involved here were all grasses and shrubs. So as they were out on the far, or at the very beginning of the ignition of this fire. As I mentioned, this wind lined up and got the fire, rolling through the grasses and through the shrubs. And it quickly exceeded the capability of the resources available to, gain any kind of containment, A, to find it, B, to get to someplace where you could get around it or try to catch it. And they're just, by that time, this thing is 10, 20, 40, 80 acres. And there's not enough resources on hand immediately to get to those kinds of things. That landscape looks also, when we talk about the urban and built environment, as we move about and have the fire come into the urban area, and the ability to fire departments to catch or to get to structure fires and to stop one structure fire versus if you have 2 or 3 going at the same time, the resources needed to work on those fires. I'll let these guys, the chiefs, talk about that. So I think the next slide. So I'm a fire behavior analyst also, and I do long-term analysis. So I spend a good chunk of my life trying to figure out how the landscape is going to burn and how it burned in the past, so that I can be better at predicting and talking about fire behavior and helping the boots on the ground have a better shift out there each day when they go out to look, to go work on fires. So we don't typically model urban fuels. The modeling programs aren't designed to do that. They're designed to, to model vegetation burning. They're not great at that either. So one quote I'll say about models is all models are inherently wrong and some are useful, which means that, it's a mathematical model. It sees trees and grass and shrubs as zeros and ones that it's going to throw into an equation. So we have to figure out how to make that equation fit so that we can show a picture and tell a story about how a fire is going to burn. So there's some really smart people who actually figured out how to make the model progress through the environment and through an urban environment so that we can demonstrate how that kind of lines up with what happened on that day. So as I mentioned, most of the fuels were grasses and shrubs before it became established in the urban fuels. And we needed to use some advanced modeling techniques to tweak the model to make it understand how to run through an environment that all the remotely sensed data that looks at what is this, what is that, to tell it how to burn through that landscape that it showed as unburnable, which typically it would be if there were snow and those kinds of things involved. This is a picture out there of an area that was taken pre-Marshall Fire. And you can see all of the elements that are involved in there. There's grass and some shrubs and some, some trees in that landscape. And I haven't actually seen this piece in real life, but apparently it did take quite a beating during the Marshall Fire. So the fire was very aggressive at all fuels it encountered, which includes homes and fences and everything else associated with that. I think next. So this is one of the advanced techniques used to model the Marshall Fire to help us kind of get a feel for what this fire could do. But realize that all these models that we do for these fires are usually after the fact, because we don't have the data, we don't have the resources, we don't have all of our models tweaked to help us figure this out in the heat of the moment. But after we learn how, and that's why we continue to model fires after the fact, so we can better understand, better train our models on how to run so that we can do better at this in the future. So the red lines that you see there, we call those minimum travel times. So those are the areas where the fire wants to go based on the topography and the fuels and the weather of that particular day. That's where fire wants to go and the fastest that it wants to go. And you can see that, and the perimeter is in there. So the final perimeter is around the outside of that. It did a fairly decent job of modeling, even as it got into the built environment, but it's still not perfect. Because as I said, models are inherently wrong. So we try to make them better. So moving on to the next slide. So, we have I mentioned that the day of the Marshall Fire was a day of extremes. We had everything lined up with the fuels. Unfortunately, the topography in that situation that was lined up with the wind, and that really helped, fuel the fire, pardon the pun, through that environment and through those fuels. So similar types of fire behavior can develop anytime we have situations and conditions that line up like this. As I mentioned, it could have happened any other day in December for the most part when we had similar type conditions. It could happen next December. It could happen anytime that we run into those situations. And as I mentioned, we also have the regular 911 work that the fire departments are doing with structure fires. And, there's a condition with flow paths where the wrong wind goes through the right door or gets a fire in a structure that, exceeds that one structure and spots embers onto the adjoining houses where there's radiant, heat to the adjoining structure. You could easily see, 1, 2, or 3 fires, structure fires, all going simultaneously. I use historical examples of, say, the Chicago fire and Peshtigo and some of those other fires from a long time ago. So this is not new to us. It's just not common to us, if that makes sense. So that really kind of wraps up kind of what I wanted to just present on kind of a very general scale for what happened with the Marshall Fire. We don't have to dig into any specifics, but we're going to hold questions for the end, and I'll turn it over to Seth.
Oh boy. All right. So just quick introduction. My name is Seth McKinney. I'm the fire management officer for the Boulder County Sheriff's Office, and I apologize to everybody for running a little bit late here. So, I guess topic on, what I'm here to speak for is kind of why the facilitated learning analysis of what we did for Boulder County. And I think that came around from Chief Beebe from Mountain View. So when we had the fire, we had a type 1 incident management team, a federal incident management team to come in and help us manage the fire. The complexities that came from that fire were far greater than we could manage at the time as a county. So we worked with our federal partners, ordered up federal and state partners, I should say, to order up an incident management team, and they came in. We got the fire out with the help of the snow, but there was a lot to clean up afterwards. And so during that time period, the incident commander of the team came to Chief Beebe and said, "Hey, we need to capture this. We need to capture this for historical purposes. We need to bring in, a team of experts to really analyze this." And I was fortunate to dig up, the scope of what the facilitated learning analysis was to identify. But I really want to highlight the fact that it was really for educational purposes. We wanted to capture, the most honest side of kind of why the incident happened. And Rocco, sounds like you captured a little bit of the weather and the fire behavior.
Yeah, and I talked a little bit about the FLA
Okay.
and, the DFPC's ordered the team to put that together.
Okay,
So, yeah.
perfect. Okay, so
Vision of fire protection.
yeah, that's our state fire agency. So kind of how wildfires work is we've got a lot of different levels of authorities and jurisdictions, and got a really good pipeline for an escalating incident. And what we're seeing, especially with the Marshall fire, is that escalated really fast. So we got a fire that starts in maybe one fire jurisdiction. It escalates to the point of, hey, we need more help. The county comes in, we bring in additional county resources. And for the Marshall fire, we were overwhelmed. We started reaching out to additional partners, reach out to our state partners, and they kind of used their influence to grab in more people until it escalated up to the federal level and started bringing in federal resources in. But that happened really fast on this fire. So the incident management team that was ordered up was through the state, but again, just a lot of partners working together and collaborating on that. So I'll kind of touch on the 6 points of what the facilitated learning analysis was meant to cover. The scientific understanding of the weather and atmospheric conditions that contributed to the incident. Sounds like you talked about that a little bit. The detailed analysis for fire behavior that led to the conflagration fire event. Coordinate and participate as appropriate with the other entities. I'm not going to list off all the acronyms here, but a lot of other really smart fire people. And that's, other fire agencies, other nonprofit groups. Talk about the communication interoperability among responding resources, the mobilization and mutual aid of resources, and then general lessons learned. So again, we had a group come in that was assembled from across the entire US that were really subject matter experts in a certain area. And some of those folks were local, and we had people from Wyoming and Washington and California all come in to kind of tackle one certain aspect of the fire that we wanted to research based on those 6 things that I listed off. And really that outside perspective was important so that we didn't have any biases in that investigation. Investigation may be a wrong word, but kind of in looking into what we could potentially learn from this incident. So again, a lot of people coming in to tackle certain aspects. Our communication processes with dispatch. We're fortunate enough to have NOAA right here in our backyards. A lot of their scientists, I think, helped create the weather products that came out in the review. There was a lot of time spent talking to all the first responders and piecemeal together what happened, because from our dispatch center, that was one of the biggest challenges initially, was that we couldn't really, picture the event. From the dispatcher, what the dispatcher was saying was a lot of different individual calls. And so it took us a little while to figure out that all these calls were all the same incident. So just a few different aspects on there. Okay, I've been rambling a little bit. Any questions for me regarding what I talked about a little bit? Okay, questions at the end. Okay. That's why he's got chief in his title. I'm gonna pass this on to anybody else. Okay.
Thank you. So next, we're gonna talk a little bit about those lessons learned from the FLA and how they're being applied at the local and state level. And we'll start with our chiefs.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. Good evening, everyone. So I want to touch on a couple of items that we've learned from this fire. And I want to kind of paint a bigger picture or a better picture. And I'm going to start with fuels first. And that is if you remember back in 21, in the spring, it was really rainy. And so the grasses and those kind of fuels grew a lot and they grew tall. And then in the summertime, it dried out. And in the fall, which we normally will get some more moisture, it didn't arrive. And then we also anticipated snow, December 30th. We should have snow on the ground, at least most of the time. And what happens with the snow is the snow will pack the grass down. And so the fuel can't carry it as quickly and as fast normally. So you have to kind of keep that in mind a little bit. We don't have a fire season anymore. The fire season's all year round. One of the lessons we learned is that when we did get the wind warning that day, actually those couple of days in that area, or that time, it kind of stopped in Boulder. It didn't extend out to Louisville. And so what we've done is we've worked with NOAA to try to expand that kind of warning. So when the wind does affect all of us, we have a better warning system for all of us. The modeling that Rocco talked about, there was never a modeling for wind-driven fires at 100 miles an hour. We do have one kind of now, they're working on one, but still, most of the time, and I've been in the fire service for 40 years, I've never seen a fire jump a 6-lane highway before. I've seen it jump Colorado River and I-70 in the Glenwood area, but this is an extreme fire behavior that we had that day. Some other lessons learned that we have, and that was just mainly the fire behavior, and that's what we kind of started off with. But other things that we've learned is better evacuation notices, better ordering for resources. But think about what was happening that day. We had a fire north of Boulder that took out a lot of the mountain resources that we normally will help us. We had the city of Boulder that was experiencing a lot of incidents in their neck of the wood, basically. And if you think about where our fire started, Marsh Fire, it's just south of Boulder. And so a lot of the Boulder resources could not help us because they were busy with their incidents that were occurring in the city. So we were starting to order resources. The other lessons learned that we have, that we've learned, is basically that when we do have extreme fire behavior, we're going to add more resources up front. That day, when we got a report of wires down, that's how it came in originally, is that we were sending one battalion chief and one fire engine. And that fire engine came from Mountain View and the battalion chief came from Louisville. They got on scene, then they started seeing some smoke. And so we started adding more resources at that point. But now what we're working on, and we're working with the county, the fire districts and the state, all working together, is to order more resources up front. So we bear a bigger effort basically up front than what we had that day. Of course, if we were trying to order that day, we weren't going to get the resources because we were just slammed. So I think that's some of the items that we have learned. I think I'll pass it on to Sterling.
Sterling Folden, I'm the deputy chief of Mountain View Fire. I handle the operations side of the house. Sorry, I'm a wanderer, so I like to stand up and talk because I get a little nervous about it. And I'm not texting, but I have my notes on my phone. So yeah, lessons learned for us, for me at Mountain View. I have personal lessons learned. I was on that day. I did respond to the fire. And then we have organizational lessons learned as well. But new fuel model, as we've all talked about, are our homes. Yes, we understand that homes are fuel, and we understand that in the fire service. But the thing that we think about was the atmosphere was so dry that day that everything, your house was like wrung out like a sponge. So you know, in the summertime or in the wintertime, your floor gets big cracks, and if you have a wood floor, you have to connect that now, right? It's prime. The fences, the siding, shingles, your patio furniture, cushions are super dry. All your bushes were dry, so all that becomes a highly flammable fuel, which typically you don't think of your house as sitting there like just ready to combust, right? But we've learned that lesson. Other things we've learned at Mountain View, there's a mindset change that, you know, be able to deal with something that you've never seen before. You have to be able to change your mindset, right? And get out of the mindset that this can't really be happening, but it is happening. So you have to recognize that it's happening, have a mindset change. We did that day. We swapped from this is a structure fire when we originally showed up to we have to just work on evacuations, make sure everybody gets out. You have to be able to make that change fast. So we're training people to be able to shift gears quicker to be able to do that. But we'll talk about that in some of our stuff that's about our initiatives and projects. The thing I learned that is a huge force is neighbors helping neighbors. So tons of stories, lots of heroic acts that day. Amazon people throwing packages out, loading people in their cars, right? Neighbors emptying their valuables out of their cars and putting people in to get them out. Neighbors helping neighbors is key in a disaster to help people survive, right? We as a fire department want to help, and we're doing everything we can. That day we're overwhelmed. I had many fire trucks in downtown Superior on all those blocks and fires I would have normally had on one single structure fire. We were stretched thin, beyond thin. So neighbors helping neighbors was a huge deal. A lot of people made it out safely because of their neighbors. Big lesson learned for us. The other thing I've learned is to change our outreach a little bit. We used to come around, right? Change your clocks, change the batteries, your smoke detector. We've now started adding things like check your insurance if you haven't done so. Opt into an emergency alerting system if you haven't done so. So it's change your clocks, change your batteries, check on your insurance, and opt into your emergency notification system. Let's see, what else have I learned? We had all sorts of things that we learned. We couldn't get food to our firefighters that night. We couldn't get fuel to the fire trucks that night because we had to turn off the power. We had cleared out 40,000 people. So now we're doing, you know, an hour round trip for fuel for fire trucks. So we've adjusted to that. The lesson I learned personally is we have a gap in an incident like this, a rapidly expanding incident. 3 to 6 hours, the emergency agencies are on their own. Office of Emergency Management is trying to spool up. Type 3, Type 1 teams are trying to spool up and get in and get us help. But really for 3 to 6 hours, the first responder is on their own. Food, fuel, water, things like that. So we've made adjustments within Mountain View. I'll talk about when we get to that part about how to try to fill the gap, or we're trying to shorten the gap by getting people up and working faster. So those are some other lessons that we've learned as well. You know, try to plan for the worst, but as Mike Tyson says, everybody's got a plan until you take a punch in the mouth. This was that punch in the mouth, but you know, we're better prepped for that punch in the mouth next time. Another lesson learned is we didn't have a red flag warning that day. Had a high wind warning, no red flag, right? And usually red flag is what we trigger us. Is red flag warning, super high probability of burning. We've learned that that's not necessarily always the case. But the other thing we're becoming aware of is alert fatigue. So we get in the fire service, I think, you know, where we get alarm fatigue, or people get that alarm fatigue, this alarm's constantly going off, you learn to ignore it. Well, if every day I come out and tell you it's a red flag day, please put all your seat cushions away, don't smoke, don't use lighters, don't mow your yard, don't do all this stuff. People finally get tired of it. So we have to balance these warnings and what we publicize with alarm fatigue or warning fatigue for the public. What else have I got? The other thing I learned is this can happen anywhere to anybody. And this will happen again somewhere. We just have to be better prepared, and can we mitigate as much risk as we can you can't mitigate 100% of risk out of your life, but we can try to mitigate as much risk as we can, but this will happen again somewhere along the Front Range. Those are just a snippet of my lessons learned. We can ask me more questions later when we get into questions, but that's kind of my piece of that so far. I'll go to the county.
Yeah, I agree. There's been a lot of, been a lot of work on what we can do better. I don't have it quite on my phone, but just a few notes that I'll talk about at the county level. So our comm plans, the communications in the county between different fire districts is tricky. And quite honestly, between this county alone, we've got 25 different fire districts in the county. So every square inch of the county is covered by a fire district, which is absolutely our benefit. We've got a lot of partners out there. But a lot of varying degrees of the capabilities of those partners. So about 15, 16 of those fire districts are in the mountains. They're volunteer agencies. So what they can provide varies compared to what's needed on the flats. We're using different radios. So, again, capabilities of the individual fire districts, usually historically, it's been the departments in the flats coming up to help the mountain agencies. And so we reversed that this time, and I think they did a pretty good job for what they had. But that's one area we've really kind of focused our improvements on, and how we can support the mountain agencies to, be more standardized across the entire county. So in that is established comm plans. We've got not just 2, but now 4 comm plans to kind of tackle the different areas in the county at both the VHF and the digital radio level. I know that's getting into the technical stuff, but different ways how firefighters can communicate with each other, and something that's pretty established, so that we're not having to, hey, is someone over there using this frequency because I need it over here, type thing. Additionally, the evacuations has been a huge point from our Office of Disaster Management and Comm Center. Things have changed really fast, and I applaud our folks for adapting and being really proactive about making those changes as needed. But our evacuation plans differ now than what we had on the Marshall Fire. We had started a county evacuation polygon project, which is really geared towards the mountain communities. It was not expanded into the flats. Since then, our deputies, our law enforcement has worked really hard to expand that to make sure the entire county is covered on these quick reaction evacuation plans. And that, I think that topic continues. Sorry, I'm looking at you, Dave, but yeah, that topic continues. So we're continuing to evolve that. General coordination, talk about our mutual aid plans,